This is a recording from December 3rd, 2024. In it, the current president of South Korea declares martial law in the country.
세력의 위협으로부터 자유 대한민국을 수호하고 우리 국민의 자유와 행복을 약탈하고 있는 자유 헌정 질서를 지키기 위해.
But just 6 hours after this speech, the president rescinds his decree. He is banned from leaving the country and named a suspect in a treason case.
그러나 조금 전 국회의 계엄 해제 요구가 있어 계엄 사무에 투입된 군을 철수시켰습니다.
Surprised? For some reason, we're used to North Korea being the bastion of dictatorship, where no one in their right mind would want to live. Meanwhile, its southern neighbor with whom they are still at war, the Republic of Korea, looks like a technological paradise whose culture permeates every corner of the planet compared to its unattractive northern comrade. However, if you look closely, you'll see that South Korea is anything but a paradise. Over the past 70 years, 4 of the country's 13 presidents have been convicted for corruption, and 1 was even sentenced to death.
Bribery, abuse of power, coercion, and leaking government secrets.
17 years in prison for corruption, bribery, and embezzlement.
These political games are rooted in the fact that behind South Korea's glamorous success are just a few powerful families who today own half the country. In the 1950s, these were small family businesses that supplied noodles and repaired cars. But with government support, they raised the country from the ashes of World War II and became the largest corporations in the world, which you know very well: Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and others. For many of us, South Korean companies are associated only with home appliance and automobile manufacturers. But in South Korea itself, these corporations are involved in literally everything, from food production and highway construction to the creation of heavy weapons. Today, the heads of the largest conglomerates are implicated in corrupt deals worth hundreds of billions of dollars.
Local court has approved an arrest warrant for Samsung's heir apparent Lee Jae-yong in connection to the massive corruption scandal gripping Korea.
Presidents are replaced at their behest, and more than half of young Koreans between the ages of 20 and 40 believe they have no chance of building a successful career. How did South Korea become a glittering veneer of prosperity, concealing decades of economic missteps by its leaders? Let's find out. There is a small peninsula between China and Japan. Today, North and South Korea are located on it, but a little more than 100 years ago, there was a completely different state here. Chosun, or in translation, the country of morning freshness. Chosun, along with Japan and China, was far behind Europe, and all because the Eastern countries for a long time did not want to open up to the outside world. But if China and Japan, in the end, were forced to modernize themselves so as not to become the colonies of Europe, then the small Chosun itself was influenced by Japan. And while China is buried in civil wars, the Japanese authorities have acted with Chosun as recently as the United States did with Japan itself. In 1876, the Japanese arrived on the shores of Chosun and forced the country's authorities to sign a special treaty. This treaty granted the Japanese free access to 3 ports on the peninsula: Busan, Incheon, and Wonsan. Japan thus gained a new market for its goods and a springboard for building its power, right next to its main rival, China. Japanese textiles flooded the Yuseon market, and in exchange, cheap rice, the staple food for workers in Japanese factories, flowed from Chosun to Japan. And realizing that Chosun had become heavily dependent on its rival, China advised the peninsula's authorities to conclude treaties with more than just the Japanese. Thus, the United States, England, Italy, and Russia arrived in the land of the morning calm. All these countries saw Chosun as both a promising new market and a weak rival through which they could strengthen their position in the heart of Southeast Asia. Thanks to this attention, Chosun itself was transforming from a feudal village into a capitalist economy, where social stratification quickly set in. An influx of cheap textiles ruined local weavers, and food prices rose because landowners were now selling rice for export. While some residents built their homes from clay and vines, others could afford taxis and servants. Before, everyone had lived equally, if not affluently. But now the majority of Chosun's population was even poorer than before, and foreigners were in charge. This laid the foundation for the peasant revolution that broke out in Chosun in 1894. To suppress it, the authorities requested military assistance from China, Chosun's patron and older brother for centuries. At this point, Japan realized that this could lead to a loss of influence over Chosun. Under the pretext that China had illegally introduced its troops, Japan sent its own. Thus began the First Sino-Japanese War, won by a more modernized, equipped, and prepared Japan. Under the peace treaty, China ceded control of Taiwan to Japan and recognized Chosun as a completely independent country, but effectively renounced any patronage over it. The king of Chosun, given complete carte blanche, renamed Chosun Korean Empire in 1897 and appointed himself its first emperor. Clearly, this didn't effectively transform Korea into an empire, but adopting this title was intended to elevate Korea's international status as a now completely independent country. However, although Chosun ostensibly became an independent Korea, it effectively became a Japanese protectorate. Pro-Japanese local officials held key positions in the government, and most industrial assets remained in Japanese hands. A couple of years later, in 1905, Japan completely defeated two rivals' claims to Korea. The Russian Empire signed a peace treaty with Japan and recognized Korea as a Japanese zone of influence, while the United States ceded Korea after Japan reciprocated by ceding the Philippines. In short, at the beginning of the 20th century, Korea found itself under Japan's monopoly, which began implementing a strict assimilation policy. Koreans were forced to learn Japanese, convert to Japanese religion, and give their children Japanese names. However, this period in Korean history cannot be called an absolute evil. After all, it was a time of economic growth. Production in agriculture, fisheries, and industry increased almost tenfold. Seoul acquired electricity, trolley buses, running water, telephones, and telegraphs. Japan built large factories, schools, and railroads in Korea. While in 1900, everyone in Korea traveled on wooden carts by the start of World War II, more than 6,000 kilometers of railways had been built. Naturally, Japan did all this for its own benefit, so that Korea would become an excellent food supplier and a very convenient market. But it was during the Japanese colonization that the foundations on which South Korea's modern economy rests were laid. And you'll understand it all now. Meet this man, Lee Byung-chul. His name, I'm sure, means nothing to you, but you certainly know the name of his company. Perhaps you're listening or watching this story right now, holding his company's product in your hands. Lee Byung-chul is the founder of Samsung. Yes, the same Samsung that today produces flexible phones and designs the world's tallest skyscrapers, from the Burj Khalifa in the Emirates to the Lakta Center in Russia. But today, Samsung is the largest corporation in South Korea, but back then, it was a small office in the town of Daegu. In the 1930s, Samsung produced rice flour, dried fish, and noodles, exporting them all to China. Another Korean, Quinn Hui, was producing toothpaste in the 1940s. At the time, most Koreans brushed their teeth with plain salt, so toothpaste quickly became a hit. This tooth powder would later become the basis for the legendary Lucky toothpaste, which would become so popular that its name would be associated with every toothpaste in Korea. However, I'll tell you more about this toothpaste a little later, because you can't even imagine what Queen Ho's company would become. Finally, another enterprising Korean, Chung Ju-yeon, was involved in car repair, and for good reason. The main mode of transportation in Korea in the 1930s and 1940s were outdated Japanese and American cars that required frequent repairs and maintenance. So Chung Ju-yeon took out a loan and bought a workshop, from which his business gradually grew. However, at the height of World War II, the Japanese government took over the auto repair shop, merging it with a metallurgical plant. Incidentally, what was actually happening in Korea during World War II? It was essentially a Japanese colony where resources were taken from, while the Koreans themselves were forced to work in military factories and serve in the Japanese army. But as you know, Japan lost World War II, and after the capitulation of Asia's leading empire, the Korean peninsula was liberated from occupation. And now we can begin the next chapter in Korea, which the other two superpowers will tear apart. In 1945, Korea was liberated from Japanese occupation by Soviet and American forces, and it was to become a democratic country with an elected president. But before then, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to divide their spheres of influence. Everything above the 38th parallel was controlled by the Soviet Union's military administration, and everything below was controlled by the United States military administration. This occurred on August 10, 1945. But even after Japan finally surrendered on September 2, 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States were still unable to agree on how to conduct elections in Korea. Each power wanted to install a government loyal to itself. Therefore, in the North, the Soviet Union built a socialist system and supported local communist leaders. Meanwhile, in the South, the United States vigorously implemented democratic institutions and supported pro-Western politicians. Ultimately, the countries failed to reach a common compromise. In 1948, presidential elections were held in the south of the peninsula under UN auspices. Thus, the Republic of Korea was born. In response, a month later, the Soviet Union established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the northern part of the peninsula. Kim Il-sung, grandfather of the current North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, was appointed its prime minister. Naturally, these were two completely different political systems. Each side considered its region the true Korea and its neighbors traitors. And in 1950, a war broke out between North and South Korea, which lasted 3 years and ended, no, not with peace, but simply with an armistice. Since then, the two Koreas have been separated by a demilitarized zone, and the countries remain at war to this day because a peace treaty between them has yet to be signed. The Korean War drove both countries into a very deep economic hole, from which they have begun to climb out in different ways. If you look at the physical map of the Korean peninsula, you'll see nothing but mountains and hills. Only a third of its territory is suitable for agriculture. While the North is fortunate in its abundance and diversity of mineral resources, South Korea isn't so fortunate. The total value of mineral resources there is estimated to be approximately 20 times less than in the North. With these resources and with the support of the Soviet Union, North Korea began building large metallurgical plants and electrifying its region. The United States, of course, couldn't allow South Korea to be worse off than North Korea. It was an ideological race that couldn't be lost. From 1954 to 1959, the United States allocated approximately $1.5 billion in subsidies to South Korea and then began large-scale privatization. Land plots were forcibly purchased from large landowners and sold to farmers at below-market prices. Now more farmers could own land, reducing social inequality. By the way, I hope you still remember Chung Ju-yong, the one whose auto repair shop was confiscated by the Japanese during the war. In 1946, when the occupation ended, he reopened the same business, as demand for auto repair in Korea had only increased after the war. And Chung had some savings and, most importantly, an understanding of how to develop such a business. He called his new company Modern, which translates into Korean as Hyundai. Korea's economy grew, and so did Chung's business. By 1950, Hyundai was not only repairing cars, but also taking on any orders to rebuild damaged infrastructure, and even building barracks for 1,000 American soldiers. By the end of the Korean War, Chung's company had become the primary contractor for the Americans and was able to obtain construction equipment from them that its competitors lacked. As a result, Hyundai received the largest construction contracts from the South Korean government, but because others lacked the same experience and resources. Another businessman, Lee Byung-chul, yes, the same one who sold groceries at a store called Samsung. During the Korean War, he fled Seoul because his company's warehouses were burned by the North Korean army. But when South Korea retook Seoul, Lee Byung-chul, using his connections, gained access to government contracts for noodles, sugar, fish, and other essential goods. The thing is, Lee Byung-chul wasn't just any Korean. His father, for one, was a friend of South Korea's first president. Soon, Samsung built a sugar factory in the city of Sudong, which later grew into South Korea's largest food holding company. In 1954, Samsung opened the largest woolen fabric factory, and in 1958, for convenience, it acquired a bank and an insurance company. Yes, that's how quickly business grew in a post-war country with the right connections. Finally, Koo In-hway, the same inventor of the popular Lucky tooth powder, opened the Lucky Chemical Company after World War II, which began producing face cream. This product helped the company transform tooth powder into Korea's first toothpaste, also called Lucky. Its popularity is largely due to the fact that in 1953, Lucky placed its toothpaste not in glass or porcelain, as its competitors did, but in a plastic jar. To achieve this, Lucky Chemical opened Korea's first plastics factory, producing not only toothpaste packaging, but also soap dishes, combs, and even water pipes. You might ask, why didn't the government prevent the emergence of such monopolies? Because the country needed to rapidly develop heavy industry and technology to escape poverty. Small private firms simply couldn't compete with international companies. The Korean government saw an opportunity to rapidly develop industry not through market competition from scratch, but by supporting established businessmen who simply needed a little help. So, in 1958, the monopolist Lucky Chemical founded a company called Gold Star, which was intended to produce home appliances for the Korean domestic market to avoid the need to waste money on imported electronics. A year later, Gold Star released the first Korean radio, and a little later, the first domestic fans. By the end of the 1960s, Gold Star had produced the first domestic refrigerator, air conditioner, and even an elevator. You might ask, where did this company go? We know nothing about it. No, you see, in 1995, Gold Star and Lucky Chemical would merge to form Lucky Gold Star Corporation, or LG for short. Samsung would also enter the home appliance industry, choosing televisions as its primary niche. Meanwhile, Hyundai was building Korea's largest structures, the Soyang Dam, the expressway between Seoul and Busan, and the world's largest shipyard. Meanwhile, Hyundai transitioned from car repair to manufacturing. First, they released a car in collaboration with Ford, and a few years later, the Koreans produced their first domestic car, the Hyundai Pony. Of course, companies like Hyundai, Samsung, and later LG grew out of family clans. At a time when the country had nothing but an opportunity to corner the market, they were able to do so first, thanks to their connections and experience. Then, government funding transformed them into the country's largest businesses. These companies began to be called by a new term, chaebol, which translates as rich family. As you'll see below, one person in such a family controls many companies that dominate entire sectors of the Korean economy. The authorities found it very convenient to work with the chaebols. But judge for yourself, Samsung Electronics, which produces televisions, will always repay its debts because it is overseen by its parent company Samsung, which owns food production, insurance, and banking businesses. And the authorities had been working with these families for years. It was much easier to trust them than new faces. And you'll agree, it's easier to control and finance 10 companies instead of 100. In short, the chaebols had every opportunity to grow. And they did. In 1973, their share of the country's GDP was around 10%. By the end of the 1970s, it had risen to 16%. And 10 years later, it was 33%. The final point of monopolization of the South Korean economy was the decline of American aid. In the 1960s, the United States became involved in the Vietnam War, and funding for South Korea began to decline significantly. Meanwhile, dangerous North Korea, just across the border, remained. And so, since the 1970s, South Korea has been actively producing military goods. And who could do this but the chaebols? In fact, no one. So don't be surprised by a tank from Hyundai or howitzers from Samsung or Kia. In short, the original plan worked. The chaebols, thanks to their scale, technology, and cheap labor, produced cheap goods. They actively exported their products and earned foreign currency to purchase foreign technology and equipment. And South Korea's economy grew at a breakneck pace, and so a previously poor agricultural country became a center of innovation and science. However, the government's reliance on family monopolies proved a fatal mistake. And for seemingly simple decisions, there's always a price to pay. And for South Korea, that price came very quickly. Imagine you're the president of a country with a population of 40 million and a mediocre economy. You have a choice. Unleash the market and let the most efficient companies emerge from competition in a decade. Or support existing companies by investing in them. What will you choose? The South Korean government chose the second, easier path. They gave the country's most influential families the opportunity to quickly corner the domestic market before foreign competitors did. But as a result, these families began to entangle the entire country with their connections. Hyundai, for example, illustrates this well. Take a look. In 2004, Hyundai was headed by Chung Mong-koo, the son of the company's founder. He directly owned other corporations, such as Globus and Changwon. The former was involved in logistics, the latter in defense. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. If we delve deeper, we'll see that Chung Mong-koo owns stakes in Hyundai Motor Company, which manufactures cars, and Hyundai Mobis, which produces auto parts. And they own a controlling stake in Kia. I&I Steel and B&G Steel are the largest steel companies in Korea and supply Hyundai and Kia factories with the steel so essential for car production. It turns out that the Chung family can influence entire sectors of the Korean economy through a web of industrial and financial companies. And in exchange for the authorities turning a blind eye to South Korea's monopolization, chaebol provides them with billions of dollars in financial support. The culmination of this alliance in South Korea was the wedding of the century, when in 1988, the daughter of the then president and the eldest son of the chairman of Sungkyong Group, South Korea's second largest chaebol after Samsung, married.
유학생이던 최태원 노소영 부부는 100년 가약을 맺습니다. 현직 노태우 대통령의 장녀와 결혼식장은 청와대 영빈관이었습니다.
It is surprising that from the 1990s to the present day, 3 South Korean presidents have been sentenced to prison and 1 even to death. The reason? Corruption. The recent president of South Korea, 65-year-old Ban Keong-hee, was removed from office as a result of impeachment. But this is commonplace in South Korea. She was accused of extorting bribes from the heads of major South Korean companies, including Samsung. And in 2018, the son of Samsung's owner, the head of Samsung Electronics, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for bribing the president's girlfriend. And the president herself was sentenced to 25 years. And now you might think, well, corruption exists in every country. But South Korea is doing well. At least they're fighting it. Look, they jail presidents and the government constantly changes. But what if I told you that none of the presidents, let alone executed them? None of them served their time. They were all pardoned after a couple of years. In 2018, Ban Keong-hye was sentenced to 25 years for corruption. And in 2021, she was pardoned by a new president and she was released. Incidentally, some of these cases were investigated by South Korea's current president, Yoon Suk-yeol. He worked in the capital's prosecutor's office during the nationwide corruption scandal. But despite this past, when Yoon Suk-yeol became president, he didn't initiate any radical reforms to the chaebol or eradicate corruption. It was a bit of a déjà vu. As a result of this impunity and monopoly, the chaebol themselves became extremely ineffective. By the mid-1990s, the debt burden among chaebol reached 500 and even 700%. To help you understand how critical this situation is, I'll give you a very simple real-life example. Imagine you own an apartment worth $200,000. You also have a car worth $20,000 and savings of $10,000. That's all your assets. Together, they're worth $230,000, but you're also saddled with a $150,000 mortgage. You also have a $15,000 car loan and an additional $8,000 in credit card debt. In total, your total debts amount to $173,000. And if you subtract your debts from your assets, that's practically everything. We get $57,000. That's your net worth, which belongs solely to you. Now we divide your debts by your net worth, and we get 303%. That's roughly the situation South Korean chaebol was in the early 1990s. It seemed like it had assets, but they were obtained through loans that had to be repaid somehow. And so, huge loans and the inefficiency of its monopoly position turned chaebol into a powder keg that was simply bound to explode. And it exploded by pure chance due to the Asian crisis in 1997. Not only South Korea's chaebol, but also companies in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan had accumulated so much foreign debt over the past decades that when their economies slowed due to competition from Japan and China, the Asian tigers simply deflated. When it became clear that companies from South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan were unable to cope with the debt they had incurred, major international speculators began selling the currencies of these countries and the securities of their companies. Against this backdrop, the US dollar strengthened dramatically. Between 1995 and 2002, it rose by 30% against major global currencies. Now, Asian countries were in dire straits not only because their economies were slowing, but also because their foreign currency debt had grown due to the exchange rate fluctuations. Foreign investors immediately lost faith in the rosy outlook for Asian markets and began selling their local currencies, dumping Asian company stocks. Investors' refusal to continue lending to Asian companies triggered mass corporate and bank bankruptcies, as well as a decline in production and rising unemployment. In South Korea, this led to a sharp spike in suicides, especially among working-age men. The South Korean won also lost its value in just a couple of months, against the dollar. The strength of large Korean corporations, the ability to bail each other out with cash because they were owned by just a few families, became their weakness. And the companies fell one after another, like a house of cards, as the crisis hit them all equally. In 1997, 11 chaebols, including Kia and Daewoo, went bankrupt, and 10 large ones were on the brink of collapse. In 1998, the bankrupt Kia Corporation was acquired by chaebol Hyundai. A year later, the South Korean government liquidated Daewoo, and its remaining divisions were bought out by foreign companies.
I think that we do see there's a seriousness that is being taken by the chaebol owners at this point, and hopefully they're going to be completed on a sensible commercial basis.
Thanks to this bailout, South Korea rebounded, and by 2000, its economy had not only stabilized, but even begun to grow, though this was short-lived. Since the 2000s, the impact of the chaebols has been felt not only by the South Korean economy, but also by ordinary citizens. The media is increasingly reporting on how children from wealthy families treat others as second-class citizens. For example, the daughter of the head of Korean Air, South Korea's largest airline, caused a scandal by throwing nuts at a flight attendant on a plane due to dissatisfaction with the service.
The alleged incident came to light just a few days after her elder sister, Cho Hyuna, who infamously delayed a flight back in 2014 because her macadamia nuts were served in a bag, not on a dish.
And a young executive at the Delum Group, a construction and petrochemical company, demanded his driver remove his rearview mirror so they wouldn't see eye to eye in the reflection. Looking at the raw numbers, inequality in Korea isn't all that dramatic. It's only about 33% according to the Gini Index. That's roughly the same as France or Spain. But in South Korea, inequality is particularly acutely perceived by the population. It's no coincidence that the first South Korean film to win an Oscar, Parasite, reveals the disparity in living standards among ordinary Koreans, and the TV series The Squid Game is based on the idea of escaping poverty. I'll remind you of this again in a country that, from the outside, may seem like a technological paradise and one of the best places to live in the world. But the fact is that while the Korean elite live in expensive skyscraper districts, drive Rolls-Royces, Porsches, and Bentleys, and hang out with local celebrities, dining at expensive restaurants, some Koreans live right in Seoul, just like the characters in popular South Korean films. And the problem is, escaping this poverty is practically impossible. Chaebol pay really good money, but to get a job there, you have to beat out fierce competition. To achieve this, parents send their children to private schools, which focus on preparing for entrance exams. Students then hire tutors to help them ace their interviews for entry-level positions at Samsung or LG. Students without wealthy parents have to skimp on food and other luxuries just to afford a good education.
이렇게 직접 요리를 해 먹으면 돈을 많이 아낄 수 있거든요. 제가 계산을 해보니까 도시락 하나 싸는데 평균 500원 정도 드는 것 같아요. 놀고 싶죠. 놀고 싶고 연애하고 싶은데 지금 상황에 그렇게 해버리면 진짜 돌이킬 수 없을 것 같아서 좀 절제 많이.
So they live in tiny apartments, just 9 square meters, that cost $400 a month. And next door in the same room sits a student just like you, also studying 15 hours a day to beat you on exams. But let's say you're lucky. You were born into a wealthy family, had tutoring 2 or 3 times a week, and got straight A's at a university that cost your parents tens of thousands of dollars a year. But even that doesn't guarantee you'll get the coveted job you and your parents have been dreaming about for years. As a result of this frantic race for education, the market is literally saturated with smart people. And the competition for a job at, say, Samsung is simply incredible.
Over 100,000 people this year alone have proven their desire to work at Korea's top conglomerate, Samsung.
On an early Sunday morning, this large group of people is heading toward a local school ground. They're not adolescents looking for extra credit. They're job applicants to Korea's largest company, Samsung. Working for the conglomerate is considered a dream job as it offers stability, benefits, and good pay.
And it's impossible not to work at Chaebol because they're the main monopoly. And no other business offers such high salaries that will cover your expensive education. As a result, a quarter of young people aged 15 to 29 in South Korea remain unemployed. They are not hired for good positions, and for less money, they will never recoup their education costs. And today, 6 out of 10 Koreans believe they have no chance of climbing the social ladder. And this is not just a feeling. This is a reality that has been shaped by decades of social hierarchy, where family ties, education, and belonging to a certain class decide everything. Well, okay, let's say you're lucky and you break through and become a Chaebol employee, but this is only the beginning of a lifelong race. For a South Korean, work is not just a means of earning money, it's the meaning of life. If not you, then someone else will take your place, the one standing in line behind the fence. Because of such stress, Koreans are champions in the level of mental illness and suicide cases all over the world. Not in China, not even in Japan, a country with an extreme work ethic, there are not as many suicides as in South Korea. And strong pressure, excessive expectations from family, they only add fuel to the fire. In the eyes of many Koreans, how others see me is much more important than how I see myself. And as a result, we get not only one of the most suicidal, but also one of the heaviest drinking nations on the planet. But if you look at the alcohol consumption society in South Korea, there is nothing surprising there. The average Korean drinks about 8 liters of alcohol per year, is like the average resident of Thailand or Argentina. But it is important that this is not a drinking nation. But there are many alcoholics. 66% of all alcohol in Korea is consumed by 1/5 of the country's population. And this is what happens. Having played a decisive role in the process of industrialization and the country's integration into the global economy, effectively increasing GDP per capita by 210 times. More than in recent years, they have become the weakest point of the South Korean economy. They hinder the development of small and medium-sized businesses, limit freedom of entrepreneurship, and generate distorted competition. Small and medium-sized businesses, which provide 83% of jobs in the country, are facing serious problems. Chaebol does not leave them any chance. They copy their ideas or simply buy out a promising company, and as a result, the income gap is constantly widening, causing discontent in society, inequality, and unemployment among young people. And yet today, successful multi-billion-dollar family corporations like Samsung, LG, or Hyundai remain literally the skeleton of South Korea, on which not only the entire domestic economy rests, but also about which the government relies heavily on it. And despite all the scandals and criticism, there's practically nothing that can be done about the system. Otherwise, the entire system, so deeply ingrained in Korean culture, and the economy that has been built since the mid-20th century will simply collapse. It turns out that South Korea is one of the most illustrative economies where behind the facade of prosperity lie fundamental social and political problems that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Friends, thank you for watching my content and supporting my work. See you in the next video.